But before I go any further, let me open this up in a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Father, thank you, Lord, for this time that we can gather together to continue to worship and grow as a community. We ask that your presence would come, Lord, and fill this time. Lord, that you would speak to us in this moment, in whatever place in life that we're at. Use the words, use the time as we fellowship together, Lord, to communicate to us. We thank you for the time again, and we ask that you would bless it now. In Jesus' name, amen. Since I wasn't here this past week, I hope that you had a good 4th of July holiday and a good Thursday church meal at Koteri Ramen, which was our second to the last Thursday meal. If you look at our upcoming schedule on Zoom through the end of this month, we do have one more dinner scheduled for this coming Thursday, the 15th. And for that meal, we're going to be heading back to the restaurant, Old Town Pizzeria, which is here in Elk Grove. The email for this Thursday dinner together should have already gone out or will go out shortly. And if you're planning on taking part in that meal, please make sure to follow the link in that email and place your order before the end of the afternoon this coming Tuesday. As I've been bringing up each week, we will be meeting for indoor in-person services at SASF for all 5 weeks of the month of August. We're going to start our services on those days half an hour earlier at 10 o'clock during that month, and then after service, we're going to have a time of open gym that will last almost until 1 o'clock, at which time we'll have to clean up and be out of there by 1. If you want to just hang around and fellowship, that's fine. You can do that as well. We will continue to have food brought in and popcorn as well, because that's going to be when we're having our Xaris at the Movies series during that month. And so I hope that you can make it. Okay, it's good. At this time, I'm going to transition into my message. For today's message, I'm going to look at another passage in the Gospel of Mark. And I say another passage from Mark because it seems like I've been in the Gospel of Mark for the last several weeks, maybe even more than that. Today's passage actually occurs just prior to the one that we looked at last week and just after the one that we looked at the week before that. Jesus has just finished a full day of teaching and ministering to the crowds that had assembled near the city of Capernaum, which is the city on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he was exhausted from all of the activities. And so he told his disciples to get on a boat with him so that they could sail to the other side of the lake, to the southeastern shore, which is located in the region of the Decapolis, which, as I mentioned last week, was a foreign land populated with pagans that the Jews generally tried to avoid. Jesus, however, visited this area more than once, and this was one of those occasions. But while they were on their way across the sea, the following incident happened as recorded in the 4th chapter of Mark's Gospel. Here's what it reads. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" After a long day spent preaching to the multitude of crowds, the only way that Jesus could get some rest was to have the disciples get in a boat with him and set off from shore away from the throngs of people that demanded his attention. But even then, Mark's account says that other people got in their boats and were following after him. So it seems that Jesus' popularity was making it difficult for him to have any downtime. But then while they're on the waters, this great storm arose, literally caused by the winds that come down the mountainside. The Sea of Galilee is almost 700 feet below sea level and is surrounded by hills such that the cool air rushing down from the mountainsides reacts with the warmer air rising up from the waters of the sea, often causing these violent windstorms that the Sea of Galilee is known to have quite frequently. In this particular case, the waves became so treacherous that it began to flow over the sides of the boat, which was in danger of sinking and taking all of their lives. Meanwhile, Jesus is curled up in the stern of the boat, sleeping soundly as the disciples struggle to keep the boat afloat. In desperation, they awaken Jesus, shouting at him above the roar of the storm, "Teacher, don't you care that we are drowning?" Now you'll notice that Jesus initially says nothing to this question, but instead he stands up, rebukes the wind, and quiets the storm. Then he turns to his stunned disciples and responds to their question with a couple of his own. Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? The disciples then don't answer him. Instead, Mark writes that they were filled with awe. But the actual Greek words are literally translated as they feared a great fear. And they turned to one another and said, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I believe this particular experience was a turning point in the disciples' relationship with Jesus. And there are quite a number of truths that we can glean from this extraordinary event that took place on the Sea of Galilee. And I want to approach this or frame this message by having us look at the 4 questions that were asked, 2 by the disciples and 2 by Jesus. I think these 4 questions help us identify some of the important issues that we can learn from this story. Issues that speak to matters of faith and identity and hope. The 4 questions were essentially, don't you care? Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And who is this man? Let me begin with the second question. Why are you so afraid? Like many of you, I grew up in the church with the unspoken belief that fear is something that good Christians, faithful Christians, believing Christians should experience less of in their lives. Fear, like doubt, was something that should be decreasing in your life as you continue to grow spiritually, and the existence of either of these in your life was taken by some to be clear evidence of your lack of faith. Since fear not appears in the Bible more than any other imperative, many take that to mean that it's a commandment, which then means that, or can be interpreted to mean that fear is a sin. Or we hear that perfect love casts out fear, which means that if you're afraid, then you must not be resting in the love that we have in Jesus. Or we hear that God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. So if you're experiencing fear, then this must mean you're living outside of the power of God, and that it's reflective of your brokenness and your unsoundness of mind. And this assumption was kind of a blanket application of fear. It didn't matter the context. It didn't matter that sometimes our genetic makeups or our early childhood experiences might predispose us to different levels of anxiety and fear. Didn't matter. If you experienced fear, it was taken by many to be reflective of your lack of faith. Which ironically reminds me of a time when a group of us went to celebrate an individual's wedding, his bachelor party, by going out and playing paintball. I don't know how many of you have ever played paintball before. I'm not even really sure that the term play is the correct terminology to use for paintball, which is essentially simulated warfare, where two teams engage in combat, but instead of actual bullets, your gun shoots paintballs. Now again, I don't know if any of you have experienced it. It's been around for quite a while now, but when we played it a long time ago, it was relatively new. But what was interesting was that of the 12 or so of us that went, about 7 or 8 of us were ministers, and all of us were leaders in our respective churches. And very few of us, if almost none of us, had ever fired a real gun or even held a gun. And even though a paintball gun is not a real gun, it's still something that very few of us had ever handled before. Nor had we ever been in that kind of simulated situation before. So when they took us out to the field that would be our combat zone, it turned out to be a jungle. And they then separated our teams, and they took one team several hundred yards away. And after a while, we couldn't see each other. We waited, and this loud horn blasted to indicate that the fighting had begun. And immediately, my whole team ducked for cover. I was hiding behind a tree, and I still remember the panic I felt and the fear that was just kind of coursing through me. I was so scared. I was immobilized. And I'm kind of assuming that's how everyone else was as well, because after 10 minutes, the worker who was assigned to oversee our game, who was standing up on this high platform overlooking the field, he gets on a bullhorn and he says, "Your two teams need to engage." And so some of us got a little bit more bold, and we advanced about 20 or 30 feet, and I hid behind another tree. And then after about 5 more minutes, the individual got on the bullhorn and says, "You guys only have the field for 10 more minutes. You need to engage now." And we were so afraid. And here we were, most of us ministers, supposedly the paragon of Christian courage in our communities, and we were all cowering under trees and bushes, or behind trees and under bushes. And this was a simulated game. And the memory of this makes me look at the disciples and think, why are they afraid? Well, it's kind of obvious. They're afraid because they don't want to drown. They're afraid because big waves in deep waters are scary. Honestly, if I think about it, to me it almost seems like a silly question for Jesus to ask. And if we expand the idea of drowning to include all the ways that we human beings find ourselves over our heads in the world, then Jesus' question sounds ludicrous, if not even somewhat cruel. Of course, we're going to feel afraid as we face climate change and school shootings and pandemics. Of course, we feel afraid when broken marriages, sick children, and financial uncertainty threaten our lives. Of course, we feel afraid when sudden trauma or sickness occurs in our bodies or in those that we love. A healthy dose of fear is actually a necessary response at times in our lives. It's something that God has built into the fabric of our beings that allows us to survive or deal with threatening situations. So I don't think that Jesus is condemning the disciples' experience of fear in that moment in and of itself. But rather, I believe it has to do with their response to their fear and where that fear is taking them, and in particular, where that fear has taken them in relationship to Him, to Jesus. And this is reflected in the question that the disciples shouted out to Jesus as the boat was being rocked by the waves, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" According to most scholars, because of the way this question is worded in Greek, it can actually be seen as a statement in the form of a question. So you might translate this question more along the lines of, "Teacher, you don't even care that we're perishing, do you?" And when it's framed in that way, it's really not a question as much as it's actually a form of an accusation. Their fear has driven them to a place of suspicion and distrust and even anger toward Jesus. As one author wrote, the problem isn't fear. The problem is where fear leads. When I face fearsome circumstances, my go-to position is not trust or even curiosity. It's full-on suspicion. In my fear, I conjure up a God who is stony-faced, implacable, and loveless. A God to whom I am expendable. A God who withdraws. Once I've conjured that God, I withdraw too. I curl up tight and focus on mere survival, convinced that I'm alone. All capacity for reflection disappears. Our fears have this way of clouding our understanding, warping our judgments, and taking us to unhealthy places. On one evening, a little while ago, around midnight, I received a text, which is strange for me to receive a text at that time. I was just about to doze off to sleep when it came, and I opened it up, and it was from one of my female coworkers at my other accounting job. And the text said, "Good night, sweetie." And I immediately knew that she meant to send that text to someone else. But I was so tired that I just put the phone down on my bedstand, and I thought to myself, well, I'll let her know about her errant text tomorrow. But of course, being the forgetful person that I am, I forgot to text her back the next morning. In fact, I forgot all about that text until the following week when I was back in the office, because I don't go in the office that much anymore. And she came to my desk with this frazzled look on her face, and she said, "Scott, I sent you a text that wasn't meant for you." And I said, "Oh yeah, that's right, I forgot about that." And she said, "Why didn't you text me back?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot." Well, it turns out that text was meant for someone that she isn't in a relationship with, but the relationship, as best as I can tell, is in one of those undefined places. So when she sent that text, and she didn't receive a response that night, and didn't receive a response the next day or the day after that, she was mortified. And she thought maybe she had crossed the boundary line. Maybe the feelings weren't mutual. Maybe he's now uncomfortable. Maybe he's trying to avoid her. And so at first she said she was sad and she was hurt and depressed. But then she said after a couple of days she got angry. And she didn't even really know if she wanted to see him anymore. And all of this happened without his knowledge. She came to all of these conclusions and assumptions about him, and they were really all in her head. Now, I know I should have texted her back. But I told her at the time, I said, I'm going to use this experience as an illustration in one of my messages at some time in the future, and here it is. You see, when it comes to fear, we often experience that same dynamic in our lives. When we're facing stormy seas, or suffering through a difficult trial, or mired in some form of addictive pattern of behaviors or thoughts, and we find ourselves in these situations or circumstances that we can't control or we can't find a way out of, and we cry out to God for help and don't receive an answer, our go-to response, as the author I quoted said, is often one of distrust and suspicion. In our fear, we conjure up a God in our minds who doesn't care or who isn't present. or worse yet, is angry and displeased with us. Our fears will drive us to places of isolation where we convince ourselves not only that God doesn't care, but nobody cares. Nobody understands. You see, there's very little in this world that hurts worse than feeling alone and abandoned. We human beings can endure a great many difficult things in this world if we believe that we are cared for and understood. But if you take those things away, we easily lose perspective and wind up in a dark place. Later this month, a docuseries on the life of Naomi Osaka is going to arrive on Netflix. And it's going to provide us with insight into the experience of this phenomenal athlete who took the tennis world by storm, but then was unprepared herself for the storm of attention and demands and expectations that she would face in the process that ultimately resulted in her experiencing crippling anxiety and depression. Her quote from the movie that I think is very telling about what this docuseries is going to be all about is, "No one really knows all the sacrifices." And I think that's absolutely true. No one really knows the lengths to which she has gone to reach the pinnacle of her sport. No one knows all that she has given up, all that she has given of herself, all of the sacrifices and the unending challenges that she has had to rise up to, and the difficulties that she has had to persevere through in order to become the athlete that she is. But at the same time, that statement applies equally to us as well, because we're all unique. We all have challenges, and we all have our own distinctive internal structures such that no one else really knows our internal world and what we are going through. And when we cry out to God, the one whom we most believe can make a difference, and we don't receive a response, or we don't receive the response that we're hoping for, we gravitate and we are inclined to believe that he doesn't care, or he isn't there. Our hearts long for God to intervene like Jesus did and calm the storms of our lives. And sometimes this happens. And thank God for those kinds of moments of grace in our lives. I know that some of you have had moments like that, when the burden is lifted, or the way forward is suddenly made clear, when the fog of doubt and fear dissipates, when impossibly good news comes in the face of a bleak situation. And we should be grateful for those moments when God intervenes in our storms, and give him praise. And we must never give up praying for those things in our lives. Scripture is filled with God's people crying out to him for his intervention. But the most common experience is that the storms remain with us. And I doubt that this is news to any of you. I think there are far more of us who could tell stories about praying for a miracle and waiting and waiting and watching and hoping. And the storm rages on. Is Jesus asleep? Is he uncaring? Has he abandoned us to the storm? Not surprisingly, I think the answer to this question that is implied in this story is a resounding no. You see, I think that this story is primarily about declaring the identity of Jesus. This story is really more about who Jesus is than about what Jesus is going to do in our lives or in the world. Now, for us to better appreciate the full weight of what the disciples came to experience about Jesus in that moment, and why the Gospel of Mark said that the disciples were filled with a great fear after the calming of the storm, that then caused them to ask the question, who is this man? We have to understand something about the first century worldview at that time. In the first century world, and this is true in almost any culture of that time, not just the Jewish culture, the sea, or dark, deep waters, was felt to be unpredictable and dangerous, and even believed to contain evil elements. For the Jews, the sea often symbolized the dark power of evil that threatened to destroy God's creation, God's people, and God's purposes in the world. And you can trace this line of thought throughout the scriptures, where even in the very beginning, there is a darkness that hovers over the surfaces of the deep. There is a chaotic element to the waters of creation in the book of Genesis until God begins to bring structure and land into creation. Dark waters are threatening. It's from out of these waters that the Leviathan, some kind of large beast, resides. It's also from out of the deep that the beast in the book of Revelations will rise up from out of. Not that either of these reference actual beasts or monsters. They're likely metaphors for destructive powers that oppose God in this world. So the waters of the sea are often seen as places where threatening elements and darkness and evil reside. And so when Jesus calmed the wind and quieted the waves, it represented more than just his mastery over the physical earthly elements. It also demonstrated that he exercised dominion over the darkness and underlying evil forces that were associated with deep waters, something only God was believed to have dominion over. The reason that the disciples, and us as well, are told not to fear has nothing to do with the dangerous elements of the stormy seas in our lives or any of the dark forces that we may encounter. It has everything to do with who is in the boat with us. Our fears are ultimately dealt with through trust in someone who is greater than our fears. And I think we're all familiar with this kind of experience. We can probably all think back to a time when we were children and we ran to our parents when we were afraid of something. And in their presence, we felt a sense of protection and safety that provided us with comfort and reassurance, and maybe even a little bit of courage. Now, of course, that's predicated on the assumption that our parents exercised authority or a certain level of dominion over whatever it was that we were afraid of, which may or may not have been the case. For instance, I've used this illustration before, but if you and I were lost in the desert or in the wilderness in the scorching heat of the sun like we have today, and you looked at me with uncertainty and fear and asked me, Scott, are we going to be okay? And I answered you with as confident a sounding voice as possible that, yes, we are going to be okay. You should take absolutely no comfort in those words of mine or in my presence with you, because I know nothing when it comes to survival skills in hostile environments. However, if you were with Doug Ito, who is an Eagle Scout, and you asked Doug, are we going to be okay? And he looked around and assessed the situation, cataloged the available resources, which I'm sure he would do, and then he looked back at you and said, yeah, we're going to be okay. We have everything we need. You would take much more comfort in Doug's words and presence because he exercises a certain level of dominion over that situation. Jesus stands up in the boat and he rebukes the wind and the waves by literally saying in the Greek, quiet down. As one commentator put it, it was almost like he was reprimanding a couple of dogs, which I'm familiar with. We have 2 Chihuahuas. And oftentimes when I let them out in the backyard. They run straight to the fence, and they start yapping at our neighbors incessantly. So much so that at some point I have to go outside and reprimand them and say, "Be silent, quiet down." And do they listen to me? No, they do not, because I don't have any dominion over them either. Jesus says to the wind and the waves, "Quiet down." And the storms don't slowly dissipate or the waves die down over time. It says that it became utterly calm, complete dominion. And remember what the deep waters represented. Only God has dominion over these kinds of forces. The disciples were awakening to the knowledge of just who was in that boat with them. Some amount of time later, at the end of their journey with him, Jesus would demonstrate dominion over humanity's greatest enemy on that first Easter morning. His resurrection would affirm what the disciples were really only beginning to grasp on that evening in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. That the one who is in the boat with them, the one who has been in intimate company with them and has promised them his presence even until the end of the age, has dominion over not just life, but even death. Even the worst that can happen to us cannot separate us from his love, as the Apostle Paul said. Personally, I think I'll probably spend the rest of my life learning to more fully trust in that truth, into the truth that will allow me the grace to experience God's presence even in the storms. The grace to know that I'm accompanied by the one who holds all things in his hands, even during the harshest, most difficult places that I encounter. The grace to know that Jesus cares, even when I don't receive the response that I'm expecting or hoping for. The grace to believe in both the existence and the power of love, even when the storms rage, even when the calmness doesn't come, even when I drown. This story and the 4 questions that it contains gives us the opportunity to reflect, take stock, and learn. What false assumptions do we harbor about the nature and character of God based on the storms that maybe we have endured in life? Why are you afraid? What is it that you are ultimately fearful of? Who is this man in the boat with us? And do we have faith in him? Do we trust him? Even when the storms persist, even when the miraculous doesn't come, even when our boat is sinking. Ponder these questions as we close our time together.